Welcome to the Heroic Minds podcast, where we uncover the heroic stories of individuals battling through adversity and rising to the top of professional sport, business, and life, uncovering the characteristics, the secrets, the tactics to become the hero of your own story, because it is adversity that maximizes human potential. Welcome back to the Heroic Minds podcast. On today's episode, we have Dr. DJ Cook, neurosurgeon and farmer. Yes, full-time with both roles. How does he do it? Well, it's pretty much that passion has a way of trumping our expectations, our logic. We only have so many hours in a day, but when you're passionate enough, you find a way to make things work. There's a common theme in stories like this with people we've had on the podcast. It's no different than Steve Woods, engineering director at Google Canada, that with his initial computer software company, he was willing to fly to California and wait outside someone's door for that opportunity that he wasn't getting. And doing so, he ended up receiving that opportunity. Same thing happens in Dr. Cook's story, where he's outside of a doctor's office at 1 a.m. It's actually a funny story because there's a bit of a miscommunication that led to that. But it's putting yourself out there and taking that chance, taking that risk for something that you want more than anything else. In this episode, we talk about decision making. What's it like making decisions in brain surgery when someone's life's on the line and you're looking at this thing that we all have that gives us life, it gives us consciousness. We talk about miracles. I wonder if Dr. Cook even believes in miracles, and he gives a really interesting answer, actually. We even dive into his actual schedule, and that leads to a story about a day when he's on the farm, and 10 minutes later, he's in brain surgery, trying to remove a knife from someone's eye socket, actually. So that's an interesting story. Then we get into minimally invasive surgeries and the process of now, how if someone's having a stroke, they can put a small slit in someone's eyebrow and go in through the eyebrow. I'll let Dr. Cook explain how they then cure the issue causing the stroke, and the individual can go home 8 hours later. Unbelievable. Next, we get into human performance and how Dr. Cook is working with a team that is doing such progressive research that they can actually put people in these machines with functional imaging, apply stress to the individual, and figure out where their weaknesses are, where their imbalances are, visually in someone's brain, and the weakness of how that brain then doesn't communicate as well to the spinal cord, so we can see where the inefficiencies are and then take those individuals out of the imaging and now put them through therapy, put them through exercise that can fix those weaknesses that we otherwise wouldn't even know we have. Before we get going, I just want to touch on two important announcements. One is the mind manual that's now on the Heroic Minds website that I encourage you to check out. It's someone that's been a guest on this podcast many times, Ian Bigford, that is a great, great friend of mine and also a partner in crime with me on this Heroic Minds journey that we're on right now. And he's helping me to create and helping me with this whole project to see where it can go and how we can help and inspire the most amount of people. So he put together this blog called The Mind Manual, and what he does is break down how someone would go about improving themselves with science, with philosophy. So it's not just the idea of if you do this, this should happen. It's reasoning, it's history, it's sociology and examples that he puts together to not say one way of improving yourself is right or wrong. It just gives you a realization or an understanding of why we feel certain ways. Well, if fear is the most powerful human emotion, then this is why we feel X in this situation, and this is how we overcome this fear, or this is how we reach our goals. Here's a more efficient way of reaching our goals because this is how the brain works. And it's that science that reinforces these concepts, and it's really cool. It's interesting. I encourage you to check it out. He's got two up already. The one is about what you should aim for in life, and the second one is perception. So how to maintain motivation and focus on long-term goals. Really interesting. Again, I encourage you to check that out. The second thing is the forum that's now on the website. And I've always thought about putting this on the website, and the main reason is when I put out the episode with Troy Smith and we talked about suicide, which wasn't too long ago. It was actually only episode 36. I had, and still counting actually, 12 individuals reach out to me saying directly how that episode affected their life. and how it affected them in a really positive way. It made them have a conversation with someone. Maybe they opened up to me. So many different things where this episode and this conversation about suicide, which I didn't think I had the right to talk about, has now improved people's lives. And it was just simply having that conversation and sharing. So long story short, I put a forum on the website. It's an open forum. You can put comments. You can share your stories. It's totally anonymous. You don't have to use your real name. You can put your email in. So if anyone messages back, replies in that same forum, that you'll get an email and notified that someone has responded. So I encourage you to share. If you have 2 sentences, 2 paragraphs, anything, and you want to put something out there and say, when I was going through this issue, and maybe it's not mental health, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's whatever, it's anonymous. You can make a fake name and share your story, and someone might come along the website, and just like these podcast episodes that are conversations people don't want to have, but we're having anyways and making a difference, well, maybe your comment on the forum will impact someone's life the same way. So check it out if you get a chance. Feel free to leave a message on there or a story. Last on the docket before we get going here, check out truelocal.ca. High quality meat, individually packaged, shipped in a box with dry ice so it stays frozen for 4 days on your doorstep. And you choose when it comes, you choose exactly what comes. And if you don't like it, you can easily say, I don't want to do this anymore. And there's no extra fees, no pressure in staying a consistent customer. It's totally up to you. But I assume when you test this product out, you're going to be a returning customer, just like happened with me. And now I've got my regular box coming every month. So I encourage you to check it out. Use the discount code HeroicMinds25 to get $25 off a regular size box and $10 off a personal size box. Alrighty, here we go.
So I guess I have 2 jobs, right? And they seem very distinct. So I'm a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, and a beef farmer. The beef farming side of me is pretty straightforward. I grew up in Lindsay, Ontario on a beef farm. I learned about life and death and success and failure. And it gave me a very, I'd say, holistic or Catholic, in the true meaning of the sense of the word, sort of view on life, right? And that was something I carried with me through my education. So when I headed off to do undergraduate studies, I went to the University of Guelph, which is an agricultural school. And I suppose at that time I had an inkling towards medicine, but I didn't know for sure what I was going to do. And I was actually probably more interested in botany. And I spent my first summer after undergraduate breeding turfgrass for Pickseed Canada. And I love botany. But I took a course on neuroscience with a professor named Wayne Gatehouse at the University of Guelph. And in that course, there was a very intense portion of it that was related to brain anatomy and connecting brain anatomy to perception, so the way we perceive the world around us. And that really caught my attention. And so I headed off that summer to breed turfgrass, and that was great. I loved it. But I went back the next year and I found that professor and I said, this really blew me away. And I'm very, very keen on pursuing this moving forward. And so he said, you should really think about medical school. And so I went through the remainder of my undergraduate degree, working in different courses that really caught my attention. So human physiology with Jack Barclay. He was the professor at Guelph that I really looked up to. Super teacher, great analogies, a lot of fun. And molecular biology and genetics. I loved biochemistry. I love biophysics, which is the study of cell membranes and cell signaling, which is the basis of neuroscience and the basis of what I do now. And I really enjoyed all of that, and that became preparation for what I would do in medical school. And towards the end of my second year in undergraduate, I actually was very fortunate in a lot of ways. I contacted a professor at McMaster University, and they had a medical school there, and they were doing a lot of biological research that was interesting. And so I connected with this professor whose name is Michelle Rathbone. And I said, Dr. Rathbone, I'm this sort of anonymous undergraduate from Guelph, farm boy, but I'm really keen on spinal cord injury and learning about how animals recover after spinal cord injury and new therapies you're developing for spinal cord injury. Do you have a spot? Maybe I can come wash dishes or, make your coffee for you or whatever. And I remember meeting him. It was an interesting meeting. It was in the early days of email. So he emailed me back and he said, I'll be in my lab between 1 to 11 on Saturday morning. Come see me then. So I thought, oh, this is a test, 1 a.m. to 11. Who works those hours? And so my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, I said, we're going down to Hamilton. So we hopped in the car at like 5 in the morning and drove down to Hamilton at 6 in the morning and went to his office, and the hospital was locked. And so I convinced the security guard to let me in, and I was standing outside his office door and he wasn't there. So I thought, okay, where is he? So I went and I found a phone and I called him up and woke him up. He said, "Why are you calling me so early in the morning?" I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. Your email said you'd be in your office between 1 to 11, so I wanted to come kind of right in the middle of the time slot that you gave me." And he said, "That should have said 10 to 11.
Good start.
So he came in bright and early in the morning and made a coffee, and we sat down, and the first thing I noticed about his office was that he had a plant biology textbook on his desk. It was a plant biology textbook that I actually also owned because I was very into botany, right? And so we immediately started talking about that, and we hit it off. And so he took me under his wing. And so for the rest of my undergraduate, I spent a lot of time driving down to McMaster to work on spinal cord injury models and new drugs that he was involved in developing. And that really shaped my approach, I'd say, to research. And I still use a very similar approach now. So then after 3 years at Guelph, I applied to medical school and went to the University of Toronto Medical School. When I got to Toronto, I started looking around at what my options were in terms of continuing my research, and I met Dr. Charles Tatter. And Dr. Tatter, who was the head of neurosurgery at the time.
Yeah, I met him when I was going through my injury in hockey. He was the one I was hooked up with, so yeah, I know a little bit about him.
Excellent. So you know him. Great. So Dr. Tatter, he opened his door to me, and so I was able to meet him and talk to him about my interest in spinal cord injury research. Interestingly, at the end of that year, at the end of the first year of U of T Medical School, you have to prepare for a community health project that you'll undertake in the second year. And for whatever reason, I knew that Dr. Tatter was involved with Think First Canada, and I knew about the injury prevention work he had done. And for whatever reason, I went to him and I said, there's this community health project. Do you think maybe I could work on something related to Think First for that? And he said, oh, Douglas, there absolutely is. That's my best Dr. Tatter voice. So he said, we've done this video in the past called Smart Hockey with Mike Bossy, which was great for educating people about spinal cord injury. We're redoing it with a maintained focus on preventing spinal cord injury, but also to talk about concussion. And we've redone the filming, and we want to evaluate it. We want to know if it's having an effect. Do you think that would be an interesting community health project? So I said, absolutely. Like, that blew me away. So although that summer I returned to the farm, that's the summer I was married. So I went back to the farm and I worked at the hospital in Lindsay. But the whole time I was preoccupied with this hockey concussion project. And through that project, I got some experience and learned about clinical trials, clinical epidemiology. So anyways, at the end of that project, it was a success, right? We created a publication. We were able to actually obtain, Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation funded a grant to continue the study on. So it was turning into a bigger program. It was great. And Dr. Tatter said to me, Douglas, you're going to be a neurosurgeon. And so then it was just set in stone. I was going to be a neurosurgeon. So I spent the remainder of medical school preparing to be a neurosurgeon. And
in the summers, farming as well still?
In the summers, I would... So it's interesting. In third year medical school, you go into what's called clerkship. So you start to rotate. And back then, clerkship meant that you were on the wards and you worked pretty hard. And unfortunately, my father had passed away a few years earlier when I was 18. And my mother and my sister were back on the farm, but my sister had just headed off to nursing school. So my mother was on the farm alone. And the neighbors were being very helpful, and they'd help out. And so things were running there, but it was a lonely existence for her. And so in third year of medical school, we sold the farm. So I didn't have a farm to go back to. And it was that was hard, actually. It wasn't an easy thing for me. I didn't realize that I would miss it either. So we didn't farm for several years, and that was something I knew I had to get back to. So, and now we're back to it. But it allowed me the time and the freedom to go and study neurosurgery and become a neurosurgeon. So when I finished clerkship, I entered residency at the University of Toronto, and then I'd always wanted to be a researcher, right? So I did my PhD with Mike Timiansky, Toronto Western Hospital, in brain ischemia, working on the drug that he had developed. And then when I finished neurosurgery, I moved on to Stanford for a period of time where I learned about brain revascularization. And then when that was complete, my wife and I, we had 2 kids at the time, we sort of surveyed the land and said, what do we want to do? What's next for us? Like, where do we want to land? And we looked around, we looked across Canada, we looked throughout the United States, and this opportunity in Kingston where Chris Wallace had just moved here from Toronto, and the hospital and the university are sort of mid-range size. The research program fit perfectly with my interests. and I could have a farm like 10 minutes from work.
The dream.
Yeah, so it was like the trifecta. So we came to Kingston. And when we moved in, we bought our house like on text message, so because we moved here fairly rapidly. It was like March, so it was cold, and we moved from California to Kingston. And so we bought this house with like no notice and moved in. And my wife looked at the situation. She's like, I love it here. Like she loved the house that we were in, and there was a piece of land for sale across the road. So that's where we started OtterCreekFarms. We started building, and we started with just a few sort of random beef cattle, and then I got some purebred Angus cattle, and I started shipping in the embryos, and we started putting in the embryos. And I had some embryos from before that I had sort of stored away, and those have been implanted to cattle, so we started to bring those home, have the calves, and so the farm business really started. In the beginning, it was just me.
I was going to say, so the farm business started. Did it
Yeah.
initially start as a business idea, or was it more getting back into the... okay.
It was getting back into it, but there was definitely a goal in my mind that this had to be a self-sustaining entity to be worthwhile. I didn't want it to be a hobby farm.
That's what I was wondering, yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's a lot to take off when bite off when you're still doing neuroscience. And
yeah. And a little bit about my personality. Every time somebody would say, oh, you have a hobby farm, I'd buy 5 more cows. To this day, if anybody says to me, I have a hobby farm, I just get on the phone and I buy 5 more cows. So I'm at like 600 now.
I'll be careful moving forward here.
So it is something that was started with the goal of being sustainable. And the original goal, what I set out was, I said I wanted to have a family farm that could sustain a single restaurant with produce year-round and sustain a single full-time salary. That was the goal. And that was the hardest thing, was reaching that first goal of sustaining a full-time salary. And so it was me by myself initially, and then I had some help from a younger guy who thought he wanted to be a farmer. In the end, he didn't want to be a farmer, but he put in a lot of work. And we grew the cow population. And the second we started to see that this was going to be legit, we put up buildings, we bought equipment. So I capitalized this thing a lot. And I have a day job that allows me to put the money into the farm, and that was the goal. So my wife will tell you every penny I make goes into the farm, and it still does, because it's such an important project to me. So we have this thing, it's growing, and a year and a half ago, we hit a point where it made sense to actually have more than part-time help. We finally hit that point where it was right to have a full-time person. And I was very lucky because there was a local guy he's definitely top 10 cattleman in the country. Arguably, in my mind, he's the best. He had just finished a job at a local farm that was slowing down, and he was driving an oil truck, and somebody said, oh, you need to talk to him. So we put out the feelers, and he's a bit older than me, but he said, it's kind of nice doing this 9-to-5 job, driving the oil truck right now. I don't know. And then 5 days later, he called back, and he's like, okay, I'm coming. When do I start?
So that
was our first full-time guy. Jeff Cook is his name.
Okay.
He's an exceptional guy. He's got them, they're efficient eaters, they're healthy, and our numbers are increasing, and we're utilizing land in a much more efficient way.
And there's a difference too I look up your name online, and there's almost just as much about your farm and your product that's different than what's out there as much as there is everything about your neurosurgeon career. So
yeah,
how is it? So I learned a little bit about Wagyu beef when I was researching your story. Like, what is the difference of Wagyu specifically beef from, I guess, any other type of beef?
I think the biggest thing is that Wagyu is extremely well marbled, so there's a lot of fat deposited into the meat. The beef itself is quite tender, and the flavor profile is very buttery and sweet. So it's quite a pleasurable culinary experience, so eating it is great. It has a better fatty acid profile than traditional beef, and this is all linked back to the genetics of the animals. And the genetics are fascinating, and I'm able to understand and sort of decode some of these genetic anomalies because of my medical experience, my research experience, and then the fact that I have to communicate complex data to patients all the time when they're having problems with their brains and spinal cords, right? But there's a genetic explanation for everything. So the Wagyu, they marble really well, they taste great, it's tender. The beef takes longer to raise, so you can't get the animal to full size in sort of less than 3 years, as opposed to like 18 months for a normal North American bred animal. But during that time, they're very efficient animals. So they eat less quantity of low energy food to convert to the same amount of mass. They just do it over a longer period of time.
Okay. So they would grow in size at a slower rate?
Yeah, they're much slower. So if you put them out in a field with Angus, if you have a Wagyu calf and an Angus calf and you put them in a field together, at a year, the Angus will weigh 900 to 1,000 pounds, a heifer will, whereas that same Wagyu will weigh between 600 to 700, so dwarfed essentially by the Angus. And the Angus will have a much bigger frame than the Wagyu. But by 3 years, they'll be very similar. So that's the biggest difference in the cattle.
And now does that kind of fat or the higher fat, because the trends today is now these ketosis diets and the higher fat, is that have any connection, and that it's better for the brain, and does that have any connection to what you're doing?
Well, it doesn't really, but it's actually really interesting because I do pay attention to what's happening in the fitness world in terms of diet. And so in terms of ketosis diets or carnivore diets, right, which are very, very mainstream right now, and the fatty acid profile of the Wagyu beef, which contains much more omega-9 fatty acids, would have a slightly healthier, advantage over traditional North American bred cattle. Much like the fatty acid profile of grass-fed beef, right, is touted as being, generally healthier, generally more anti-inflammatory. Wagyu, due to a few mutations that they carry, have a fatty acid profile that matches more closely with what the grass-fed beef finishes like. So if you're making an argument that grass-fed is healthy, you can make the same argument that Wagyu is healthy. But I use air quotes when I say healthy because at the end of the day, it's still full of saturated fat, obviously. So, but I guess it has a slight advantage. I think the other cool thing about Wagyu are the additional products that you can make with Wagyu that are advantaged because of the fat. So you can make absolutely exceptional broth with Wagyu bones. The broth is otherworldly. Like, it's just terrific. And demi-glace if you're a chef, So Wagyu bones produce terrific broth, which is obviously something that's very attractive in the fitness community right now. And we're working now with cured meats and jerkies, and we're creating some products that are just absolutely delicious, and I think will be attractive to that consumer as well.
And so your role specifically at the farm today, if I were to drive up the street 10 minutes from here and see what your main role would be on the farm today with everything else you've got going on, what would that be?
Well, I mean, really what I do at the farm now, so at the main farm we have a few full-time people. So my main job now, I would say, is really, oversight in a lot of ways, understanding the genetics. I think I do a good job of that in terms of our team. So understanding the genetics and how to best combine the genetics to optimize the quality of the beef in the progeny that we produce. I do a lot of work with chefs and butchers, bringing them to the farm, showing them around, allowing them to understand how the cattle are raised and to see it in action. I do a lot in terms of acquiring new equipment, innovative equipment, trying to increase efficiency for the employees and increase food quality for the animals. But at the same time, I hop on a tractor every once in a while too, and feed hay or clean out pens. And that's actually my favorite thing to do when I get a chance. So, and I'm also quite handy when, the occasional surgical procedure or complex calf delivery comes up. I'm slightly advantaged in that respect, I suppose.
And here's a crazy question I'm curious about. Do your careers ever cross paths in any way?
Constantly.
Okay.
Yeah, my careers constantly cross paths. And in fact, when you really study it, they're totally intertwined. What I do on the farm is basically take complex data, interpret it, understand how to take that data to optimize the outcome, which is the beef product, right? The beef. So I'm taking genetic data, I'm taking performance data, I'm taking nutritional data, environmental data, putting it all together and figuring out how that is best combined to optimize the outcome. In the operating room, I'm taking data from multiple sources. So I'm looking at the imaging before an operation. I'm looking at the brain under the microscope. I have my assortment of tools that I can choose from. I'm looking at the pathology as it comes up, or as the pathologist gives me an answer when I send samples out during an operation. I'm looking at the approach that I take. How do I get to my target most efficiently and with the least risk possible? And I'm combining that to optimize the outcome. So they're exactly the same. Like the intellectual process is exactly the same. It's taking complex data to optimize an outcome, and it can be applied to many, many fields.
Wow, that's cool. So I have to ask, so I love the farm side. I wonder, does that play into, is that it's not an escape, is that something that helps to complement a career as a neurosurgeon? And I don't know if you approach it as a stressful job or as I would assume there are some days that are for sure. Is the farm, does it complement it at all, or are they both equally as, not important, but impact your life the same way?
Well, I would say that both do impact my life in similar and different ways. The farm is it's a release in many ways, right? Because you're out in the open air. It's quiet. You have some time to think to yourself. It's peaceful. It's something that's just totally different. And so you do get that sort of release from being able to do something different. Now, it's not everybody's cup of tea, right? Like, that's how I grew up. So that's why it's good for me. But it's not like I could take like one of my colleagues and throw them out on the farm in a pair of overalls and they'd feel the same way as me. Mm-hmm. They'd probably run for the hills. But different people have different things that they do, right? Like, some people run marathons. Mm-hmm. Some people, build model trains, right? I run a farm. Mm-hmm. I think the bigger thing that the farm gives me is it literally grounds me, right? I can't be taking off in a plane all the time. I can't be absent all the time. It grounds me and brings me home. And that puts me with my family, which is extremely rewarding. And we get to work on a common interest, a common project, where we're all interested in producing this quality product, and everybody's able to contribute in their own way. So my 12-year-old son, drives equipment. He shows cattle. He is highly involved. He does everything I do. And one day he'll do it better. My daughter is 10 years old, and every day she goes out and mixes milk and feeds bottles to calves. She's a vegetarian too, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. So my vegetarian daughter looks after the baby cows. Every day she's in the barn. And when I get home, she goes at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So if I get home at 4:30 or 4:45 and I stop at the barn, I know she's there and I give her a lift back to the house. And then I have a 4-year-old son who is completely obsessed with farming. He's like, surrounds himself with farm-related paraphernalia all times of the day. And so he's out there with a pitchfork, cleaning pens, feeding hay, giving his input. He knows every piece of equipment. He knows how to use it, when to use it. He'll give us, opinions on when it's time to cut the alfalfa, or when it's the right time to, seed the ryegrass. He's hilarious.
There's also, I had an individual on that farms in the city in BC. That's really, really neat, his story, that a lot of people can't afford the big farm areas to grow for agriculture. And so what he does is he actually can rent people's front yards and backyards in the cities in BC area, and we'll grow plants there, and the people that allow them, they get a discount on there. And so it's a really cool full-time job for him. And he pointed out something that we forget about is seeing the process. Yeah. Because we're so disconnected from our food nowadays. And there's so much gratification that comes to that I feel like a lot of people either miss out on or don't ever experience because we're so disconnected. But he pointed that out, and I thought there's something to that, being humans and missing that. And I feel like what you're saying is totally that whole process of seeing it through and seeing the end product and then consuming that end product. Yeah. Which is...
Well, that speaks to the ethic of farming, right? So that's a very fundamental principle in farming that I think as a society we've really moved away from in a lot of respects, right? So understanding the process, understanding how you interact with your environment to achieve the desired goal, I think that's a very intrinsic human value that people really are gratified by respecting when they're involved in the process. And so we have, not everybody needs to run a farm with, 1,000 head of cattle. Like, you don't need to do that to get into the process. I have friends who, they're now, growing tomatoes in their backyard, and they're, really enjoying it. We have lots of friends who just come to the farm to see how it works. They come to see the process, understand how the animals are raised, and then they take home the beef to enjoy it. And so I think that there is an opportunity to really connect with the consumer because there's something there. There's something there that we don't necessarily respect in our conscious mind that we need in order to sort of respect this fundamental principle of connecting to the earth. Mm-hmm. The other cool thing is that through these processes, where we're really respecting the earth and working with the earth, we're actually creating the highest possible value in our nutrition, right? And so not only are things more gratifying, the quality's higher, they taste better, but they're also nutritionally more complete. And overall, I think that's something that we need to work out in society, because there's so many benefits to it. So hearing about urban farming and market gardening, in urban centers, I mean, that's terrific. Having people in urban centers connect with farmers through CSAs to get, their produce delivered straight from the farm, that's great. Farmers who produce websites or videos on YouTube or newsletters, and they're able to feed that back to the customer to bring them into the process, that's great. I think all of these things are highly valuable. But the most important thing is getting our kids involved in this stuff so that they understand where their food comes from, and so that they develop that fundamental respect for their environment, working with their environment, and I think that it helps them in their development in a big way.
That's cool. I agree 100%. And now hearing your side of it, and then Camille's, who was on earlier, I think that's a big part of life and something we need to improve on. Now, taking that mindset, because I love that already from the farm and your approach to everything in farming, I have to ask, in a sense of performance now in your job in the hospital, in the operating room, do you have a special, like, you seem so calm, cool, and collected. Do you have any type of approach or mindset or routine in any way that you make a habit before going into or during brain surgery?
I don't. I'm a pretty free soul. So I'm not really locked down to any specific routine beforehand. I approach each case as a separate problem. So I try not to be mechanical or programmatic about the way I approach a problem. Although in general you are, but I try to treat each patient with their given issue with the same fresh mind every time. And the approach to a problem, I think a lot about what my choice of approach and what the mechanics of what I'm doing at the time of doing the operation, how that's going to impact their outcome. So if somebody's got, my best example is if somebody's got a brain tumor in their dominant temporal lobe and their entire life they've been a singer, and that tumor sits beside their speech area, well, I need to think really hard about the approach I'm taking, and I need to work with that person to understand what their best possible outcome is to achieve that outcome through the mechanical steps of the operation, taking great care not to take too much tissue or take the wrong tissue, because I know that can permanently affect their outcome, right?
And that pressure doesn't weigh on you in surgery in any way?
Yeah, no, but you learn how to deal with that, right? That's something that comes with maturity. So you learn how it's an existential experience, right? So while you go through the process of understanding what this person wants as an outcome, what their ideal scenario is within the given constraints of the pathology, at the same time, when you go to execute, it's like an out-of-body experience, right? So when you go to execute, you can't focus on all those things. You got to focus on precision, accuracy, and getting the job done exactly the way you want. But then you need to go right back into right back into character at the end of it, because at the end of it, you need to report to that person and their family what happened, whether the outcome that you expect is the same as what you anticipated preoperatively, and particularly if anything untoward happens and there's a complication, explaining to them what has happened, why it's happened, and how it's going to impact their outcome. Wow. But it is it is like a very existential experience when you're executing those moves.
Mm-hmm. That's I now I'm seeing how it is so similar to the farm, and the way you present the challenges. Like it's such a cool approach that you approach it with an open mind. You have a plan going in. You experience that outer body kind of experience when you're focused on getting that task done that you planned previously. Get that job done or as close to as you can, and then go back into character and deliver what had happened.
Yeah, it's exactly the same as like I'll give you an example, right? So you're out in the field baling hay, okay? And there's a storm cloud in the sky heading your way, and the hay's got to be baled dry. So you're driving along, and all of a sudden the shaft on your hay pickup breaks. Okay? That'd be a very unusual thing, but this is a fun example. So you look at that and you say, well, I could call Kubota or John Deere or whoever. I use Kubota equipment. So I could call Kubota and order that part, but they're going to have to order it, and it might come tomorrow morning, but that rain cloud's going to ruin my hay. Or I could figure out the problem. So I go to my truck and I grab, whatever, a bolt, and I look at and the bolt doesn't fit. Well, that's no good. So I go to plan B. So I have to go in and get some wire. And I try to wire it up, and that doesn't work. And then I go to plan C, which is, you take it to the shop and you weld it, and you get the thing running good enough. It's not perfect, but it's good enough, and you get the job done. So the outcome is what's critical, right? The other night, I got called. I sat down to dinner the other night at home, and I got a phone call from the hospital, and it was one of the emergency doctors, and they said, DJ, there's a man here with a Bowie knife in his eye, and he's not doing well, and his CT shows that the knife has gone through the carotid artery. Can you come in and help him? So I came in, and we rushed him into the operating room, and we did our thing. And so my initial approach was, I'll go underneath the brain, but inside the dura. I'll find the carotid artery. We'll pull the knife out, and then I'll fix the artery. So we tried that. But where the knife was going through the back of the eye socket, the orbit, it was too low. It was outside of the field of view. So I thought, okay, I'll go outside the dura, but over the top of the orbit, and I'll find it there, and then I'll have to open the covering over the carotid artery and fix the artery. So I did that, couldn't reach it. So then I had to go to option 3. So we had to remove the eye, remove the orbit. The eye was gone anyway. So we removed the eye and removed the orbit, and that gave me the exposure I needed to get to the artery, to fix the artery to save him. It was like 5 hours of very intense work. We lost 2 volumes of blood during that time because the whole time you're working, there's blood spraying at you. And I had to stop his heart 6 or 7 times just to try to get control of the vessel. But at the end of it, we were able to save this guy. And so, and so you really, the best plans don't always work. You've got to be resilient and be ready to move on to the next thing. You can't iterate on the same thing over and over and over again, right? Mm-hmm. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And sometimes you have to be creative because you've got to do something you've never done before, but that's the only way to get to the end. Mm-hmm. I mean, the price tag for each is a little different, right? Like spoiled hay isn't necessarily the end of the world. It feels like the end of the world. Sometimes it's not the end of the world.
For you, it does, especially.
Yeah, but sometimes you get in situations where these decisions are life and death, and so you're aiming for the best possible outcome.
Have you ever learned anything about yourself since starting this career and maybe it's the first surgery you had, similar to the story you just told? Have you ever realized something about you as an individual and maybe your emotion or your rational thought or something that you never realized you had or that was a part of you?
Well, yeah. I mean, as a part of the process of stepping out of yourself in these existential moments, you do get to look at yourself, right? And so you actually learn to step away and look at yourself. And so I've learned a lot of things about myself that are generally negative, right? And they're things that I learned to work on. I've learned, and I'm trying to, work through the fact that I have a real hot head. Like I get very intense very fast, and generally that's not the most productive way to be, right? I've learned that although I thought I was like a serious workhorse and I could just go 24/7, 365, that I'm probably not, and I need to schedule time to recoup and recover. I think I've learned that I become hyper-focused on things, and that I can become hyper-focused to the point of distraction of other valuable things, and so I have to identify when that's happening so that I can pay attention to what else is going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, but I do handle stress fairly well. Like in the moment, I'm pretty decent with massive amounts of, stress.
Yeah, I can imagine.
If the aneurysm ruptures or the artery's bleeding or the brain is herniating, I'm good at looking at that and being very pragmatic about finding a solution to the problem and acting on that solution and communicating how we're going to solve the problem to the whole team.
Wow. And so seeing all that and being involved in all that and in a way being a leader of that and having, I'm sure, endless stories similar to what you shared, do you believe in miracles? Because is that ever a thought of of hanging, do you ever look to, I guess maybe a better way to phrase it other than the Hollywood way of wording it, do you believe in miracles? Do you believe in some type of force or sense of being that, you know, we can't see that plays a role in life? Is there something bigger that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that there are things that happen that we cannot explain. They're too complex for the human brain to understand, and that there is something special about humans that we really can't fully understand. And so I don't know what it is, right? We interpret it maybe as a faith position, right? Like my family goes to church, so we have a strong faith position. But whether our interpretation of that is correct or not, I think it's probably not correct. I think it's a way that we interpret this sort of greater thing that we can't understand, this sort of, you know, energy in the universe that we don't understand. Mm-hmm. So that's, yeah, it's I don't have enough neurons to figure it out.
Right. But there's something there.
There's something. Yeah.
Do you have a situation where you thought there was no chance of something working out, or does that occur a lot in your
all the
career?
time?
Where you think that we've hit a dead end or something and something happens? Do you have an example that you would be able to share on a situation of that sort where everything's real and you're in that existential moment?
Yeah, I mean, all the time. You literally see it all the time. So I can think of specific cases, right, where I can think of this 18-year-old kid. He came in with he had a new seizure, and so he had this astrocytoma that was diagnosed, and it looked like a low-grade astrocytoma. So I took him to the operating room to operate on it. And it was right in the motor strip, and he had some weakness. And so I took him to the operating room, did an awake craniotomy to operate on it, and I sent tissue, and it came back grade 3 astrocytoma. But I thought, you know, it's like the pathology is grade 3 astrocytoma, but
which is
there's 4 grades of astrocytoma, right? There's grade 1, which occurs in juvenile cases like pilocytic astrocytoma. Grade 2 is the low-grade astrocytoma that we see in adults, which is it's a tumor of the cells that support the neurons, the astrocytes. Mm-hmm. A grade 3 tumor is then into the malignant spectrum, so that we know that grade 3 tumor progresses to a grade 4 tumor, which is glioblastoma, essentially, and is highly malignant. And so the life expectancy of somebody with a pilocytic it's curable. Like somebody with a grade 2, the life expectancy is sort of in the 15-year range, 12 to 15 years. Life expectancy with a grade 3 is more like in the 5-year range, and then with a glioblastoma, it's 15 to 18 months. So this is a spectrum of this disease. And so this disease occurs along a continuum. But what we do know about this disease is the more tumor you remove, the better somebody's going to do. So I thought, it's a kid with a grade 2 tumor that looks like it's got some conversion to grade 3, but the conversion is probably inside the tumor. I thought, I need to try and get the whole thing out. So we did a very thorough mapping, and we got the whole tumor out. And I said, it's already converted to a grade 3. Like, he's not going to be here in 5 years. Like, this will have progressed. And it's highly improbable that he's not going to be here, because all the textbooks and the papers, everything tells me there's no way. And he still comes and sees me every 6 months, and there's been no evidence of progression, nothing. And that's like super highly improbable. But the other crazy thing is that, like, he has full use of his arm and his leg again, and that's also super improbable, because we started to cut that part of the brain out. But for whatever reason, his brain is remapping and rebuilding, and I guess we understand those processes. But at the end of it all, I sort of had a very depressed outlook, right? When I talked to him, his parents, it's grade 3, it's the outcomes for a grade 3. His weakness is probably not going to get better. So the next few years look pretty shitty, and then you're going to die. That's. But here we are, and knock on wood, everything's looking good, and it's like there's some sort of like higher power like protecting the dude.
Yeah.
Like, how is this possible? So we'll keep following him, and hopefully it sticks.
Yeah.
But you don't know, and things are highly improbable. And what I've learned more than anything is I'm really bad at making predictions about outcomes in neurologic disease. Really bad. And so you got to roll with the punches, man. Mm-hmm. And
I feel like you saying that, I'm assuming you mean too that everyone would be improbable, that
sure,
or not have a good chance of predicting, because it is so. Is volatile even the word?
Yeah, volatile, variable, heterogeneous.
Right.
Yeah.
And so has there been anything that, or I guess what would be the most surprising thing about the brain that you didn't know going through school that you've now discovered as you've moved into a career?
Well, I think the thing that I've learned about the brain that is really blowing me away is that the brain has some resiliency and it has an ability to recover after injury. Because the teaching when I started out was your brain is a static structure that beyond a certain point in development is only degenerating. It's dying off every day. And if it's injured, you can't get it back. And what science recently is teaching us is that the brain has its own intrinsic ways of changing to regain function. The brain has a system within it that allows itself to rebuild and rejuvenate, and that it's possible to deliver therapies to the brain to enhance the recovery process. And I think that notion of neuroplasticity and neurorecovery is what's really captured my imagination and is going to drive the rest of my career forward.
And so where are you trying to put a stake in the ground in relation to that concept exactly, that we now realize the brain can change? And Norman Deutsch, who's written a couple books on it, I'm obsessed with the idea and the concept, because I also realize how lucky I am with what I went through, and hearing other stories of people that have went through a similar injury and maybe aren't here today or are struggling big time with the same injury as me. So it's like, not that I need the answers. I'm blessed and lucky to be where I am. But it's something that amazes me, and that recovery side, like you're saying, is unbelievable. So yeah, where do you think you're going to make the biggest impact in that, or are you already?
Well, I think it would be incorrect for me to say I've really had any impact at all. I've had a few interesting observations thus far, and the science is a lot bigger than me and my lab. Like it's a huge process. But I think that the biggest impact that we're going to be able to provide through our work in brain imaging is understanding what an individual's inherent system gives them the potential to do. So in terms of motor performance, sensory performance, cognitive performance, understanding what that hardwired system provides them and what the limits are on the system based on the anatomy. And then giving them a physiologic readout that will provide them with the ability to see where they lie within that spectrum of potential, right? So you could have a motor system, right, like a corticospinal tract, so the wiring from your primary motor cortex down to your spinal cord that lets you move fast, right? Mm-hmm. You could have, the Ferrari of corticospinal tracts, like high fiber density, excellent myelin quality.
And the myelin is the sheath.
It's the sheath, the covering, and that insulation allows transmission of signals very efficiently. Mm-hmm. And you could have, so you would have all the potential in the world, but for some other reason, like say from a stroke, the physiology of your cortex isn't perfect. So there's metabolic stress to your cortex because it's ischemic or oligemic, so it's not getting enough blood to supply the cells with the metabolic substrates for normal neurologic function. And so you have the highway on which you can drive your Ferrari, mm-hmm. right? And you should be able to, but you don't have the gas in the car. So that's kind of that analogy. Mm-hmm. And so if we can provide you with a way to fuel the car, or if we can provide you a way to take the drive down a different road, right, then we can optimize your performance to work at the limits of your potential.
Right.
And that efficient operation of the neurologic system is the difference between where you are and where you can be in terms of your performance. And we see that in athletes, right? Like a given athlete can go through junior hockey, like you did, and be a top performer. And then when they hit the NHL, they become a very average performer. And why is that? Well, my hypothesis is that they were operating very efficiently. So they were at the limits of their potential based on what they had inherently from the start in terms of their neurologic function. Whereas another player might go through juniors and be, above average to excellent. But then when they hit the NHL, they really start to take off. Mm-hmm. And you say, well, why is that? And that's because they've realized a new level of training, a new level of competition, and they have some reserve in their neurologic potential, and they're meeting that now by working into it through various training regimens or maybe nutritional supplementation. You look at some professional hockey teams where the nutrition and athletic therapy is like totally programmatic. Mm-hmm. Well, that's all built to optimize metabolic function, right?
Right.
Why do we test things like heart rate variability? Why do we look at people's sleep cycle? It's because we want to optimize their physiologic function from the ground up.
Right. So how would you, if you found someone that needed fuel, like let's take an athlete for example. So you're able to figure this out, and we'll get into how you can see that in a second. But you realize they need more fuel in the vehicle, or they need to take a different path. How what could you do, or what would be the exercises, or what's the process then to put fuel in that car?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends, right? So if somebody's at a metabolic deficit, you got to look at their nutrition, sleep. You've got to look at their autonomic nervous system function and understand where there's room for improvement, right? So if they're eating a highly inflammatory diet, then you've got to help them change that. If they're consuming lots of alcohol, you've got to change that. If they're smoking, right, that's an inflammatory process. It's going to put a metabolic stress on the system, then you got to change that. So it's just identifying where they can optimize their baseline physiology and then balance. So if somebody is wired in a way, or they have some pathology that creates asymmetry in the nervous system, then they're going to inherently put more stress on one side of the body or another during activity, right? And so in athletes, you want them to be as balanced as possible. When they're not balanced, things like sports hernias occur, or peripheral injuries, knee and ankle sprains, for instance, are common in hockey. And we can see that based on how they are inherently wired in terms of their sensory motor system. We can see it in terms of their motor performance in standardized testing, or even in on-ice observation. And that asymmetry puts them at higher risk for injury. So being able to balance that out by actively targeting that imbalance in their athletic therapy program is the way to improve things for them.
Okay. And so how nowadays, because I know a little bit about it, but with the machines or the imaging we have today, or you have today, how are you able to now see this? Because it's not just an MRI or a CT scan. Like how can you see that?
So an MRI scan involves several sequences or several different acquisitions. So you acquire the MRI signal in a similar way, but you tweak it in order to bring out certain things. So nowadays we're able to look at separate parts of the brain, for instance, how the brain is wired using diffusion tensor imaging, so it shows us the actual tracts, and we're able to grade the quality of the tracts from that. And then we're able to look at blood flow, and we're able to put people through a physiologic challenge in the MRI to look how their blood flow is modulated. We can ask people to do specific tasks in the MRI, like motor tasks or cognitive tasks, to understand how the network of connections within the brain is set up in them and what the strength of the connections are within the network. Then we can take all of that information and synthesize a map of what their potential deficits are, and understand physiologically where they lie relative to their potential, based simply on their inherent wiring and their inherent neurologic function.
Wow, that's neat. And then so you take those results and then change the lifestyle to then limit inflammation or those areas of the brain that aren't communicating properly. And that's
exactly.
There. So it's not just for health concerns or injury; it could be human performance as well. That we can take this data now and apply it to just life.
Yeah, that's right. And so the application of that data is starting to come forward. So I become involved with this company called Performance Phenomics with Dan Gallucci, who you know well, obviously, and Ben Gallagher. And what that company does is it takes data about an individual's neurologic function, and so they're including similar data to what I'm very interested in collecting. And they formulate a plan for an individual, first to understand where they lie, but then to target therapies that will help them improve their odds of reaching their potential, but also to balance out asymmetries and address metabolic dysfunction when it's seen.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And two last ideas I just wanted to quickly discuss, and one is my curiosity on now minimally invasive surgeries, and I somewhat understand that for the heart, and I somewhat understand that for knee injuries, but how are we able now to, or what is the process of doing a minimally invasive surgery on someone's brain? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so that's a focus of mine, obviously. So basically I describe it as doing big operations through little holes. So if you take a brain surgery and you think about what causes somebody to be bedridden days after brain surgery, so a big part of it is pain related to the skin incision and the muscle dissection. A part of it is approach, so how much retraction and traction was put on the brain to get to where you're going, what structures had to be interrupted or passed by to get to where you're going to operate on the brain. So minimally invasive approaches work to minimize those things that set patients back while achieving the same larger goal. And so what we're doing nowadays is finding approaches to the brain that don't involve major skin incisions or muscle dissection. So we're doing surgery through the nose, we're doing surgery through incisions in the eyebrow and small incisions behind the hairline, and this allows us to get to central parts of the brain without putting major retraction on the brain. And these things are being done with scopes, endoscopes, and some with microscopes. And it allows us to do operations like a classic one for me is clipping of a brain aneurysm. So I'm able to go in under the brain through a small hole in the eyebrow, through a hole that I can't even fit my pinky finger through, actually. Go underneath the brain to the blood vessels at the base of the brain, put a clip on an aneurysm to cure it, leave by only putting a small titanium plate over the hole that I made in the bone, sew up the eyebrow, and the patient goes home 8 hours later. So that same operation done 5 years ago would involve an incision behind the hairline in front of the ear all the way up to the forehead. The person would have their hair shaved, they would have the skin open, the temporalis muscle would be stripped off of the skull, a large hole would be placed over the brain would be exposed to the air, and then the operation would proceed. So after that operation, at minimum, that person would have a big black eye and a very sore head for days. And so we're able, and they'd be in hospital for a few days at least. So we're able to improve on that. We're doing that with tumor surgery as well. And I think that where we're headed in surgery is towards a system that provides the solution through the least invasive route, and we're probably going to see the advent of robots in improving our access and our ability to do surgery.
Wow, that's incredible. And to conclude, for my own 2 cents, in a mission I have of making a positive impact in multiple different ways on the issue of concussion in sport, in all sports, and the idea of moving on from sport after concussion, if you put into a nutshell your 2 cents for, I guess, overall this idea of concussion in sport, or what you would say to an individual that may need to think about his decision in moving away from sport, maybe it's in his best interest, or just in whatever way you want to deliver that, what is your approach to that conversation with an athlete?
Yeah, so my approach with anything is to lay out exactly what the situation is, provide all the data possible, work through the potential outcomes with somebody, and sort out what they think would be best for them. And so if you're speaking to a professional athlete who's, say, a boxer, an ultimate fighter, who's had several head injuries and is displaying evidence of head injury, you talk to them about what's the optimal recovery pattern for them, what does retirement look like for them? If retirement's not an option, what are the risks of fighting? What's the best way to time their return to fighting? And so those are the sort of the scenarios we go through. Again, I'm not dogmatic about anything with anybody. Everybody has to make their decision to be as comfortable as they are moving forward in life as they can be, right? But it's just important for people to understand the risks versus the benefits for them. So, ultimately for me, it's all just about understanding what the data is telling you, making sure it's properly interpreted, and then understanding the risk-benefit ratio or the receiver operator curve for every decision that person could make. Mm-hmm. And then helping them out as best they can when they make that decision. Right. So if they're going to be exposed to subsequent head injury, making sure they understand, what the risks are, what to look for in terms of, subsequent dysfunction that they might experience, and then helping them, recover from that and prepare again. Mm-hmm. So
that's an interesting approach. So are you off to the farm after here?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and I know your second duty calls back at the farm, so this has been unbelievable, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for coming down, and it's really nice to meet you.
That's the end of another Heroic Minds podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I encourage the feedback. The more feedback, the better. I've loved all the messages, emails I've been getting, questions, comments. Again, constructive criticism is always welcome. If I can improve on something, please share. If you have time over the week, check out the Mind Manual. Also, maybe share your story in the forum. It might help someone, and I want to see where that can go. Again, I'm just going off the feedback from this podcast, what people are saying, how it's helping them, how it's helping others. So the effects are exponential. Maybe you share your story with one person, that ends up reaching 5 or 6 other people, and then it reaches more people after that. So you share your story, 2 sentences, 2 paragraphs. Let's see where we can take this forum and continue to empower people. Thanks for listening. I'm Ben Finelli. This is the Heroic Minds Podcast.